Hola, buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar con esta charla que se llama Experiencia, Experimento. Tenemos tres oradoras de lujo, que son tres importantes curadoras de arte contemporáneo de diferentes escenarios. La primera que vamos a escuchar es Kiki Mazzucchelli, curadora independiente, editora y escritora, y ha sido curadora de muestras muy importantes de protagonistas del arte brasileño en varias partes del mundo, que desde 2017 dirige el espacio de proyectos independientes Kunstverein en Londres, y que desde este año es directora artística de la Galería Luisa Estrina de Sao Paulo. Después vamos a escuchar a Maurin Dietrich, que es curadora y actual directora del Kunstverein de Múnich, y anteriormente trabajó en el Instituto KB de Arte Contemporáneo de Berlín. Programó performance, exposiciones, publicaciones, un programa de residencias ubicado en Tel Aviv, y también la 9ª Bienal de Berlín de la revista Dis. Es cofundadora de Fragil, un espacio de exposición y residencia en Berlín, y bueno, estudió Historia del Arte y Literatura Comparada en Berlín, y es profesora en la universidad también en Berlín. Y la tercera oradora es de Buenos Aires, Florencia Malbrán. Es la actual curadora de la colección Eduardo Costantini, antes como curadora especializada en arte contemporánea con gran experiencia internacional. Trabajó en Malba, en los museos Guggenheim, en la Pinacoteca del Estado de Sao Paulo y en el Museo de Arte Moderno de Buenos Aires. Su libro La prueba del presente, ensayo sobre artes contemporáneos, se publicará este año por Beatriz Viterbo, editora. Vamos a escuchar primero la exposición de Kiki Mazzucchelli.
Can you hear well?
Sí, sí, sí.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank Agustina Strugeman for the invitation. I'm going to talk very briefly about this, which is one of my latest projects. It's currently on view at Sesc Pompeia in Sao Paulo. The exhibition is called Flávio de Carvalho Experimental. And I think it's a real joy that you have this title for this panel, because I think Flávio de Carvalho is really one of the most experimental artists of the 20th century in Brazil, and is someone whose work is really not very well known outside of even São Paulo, I would say. He's someone who was born in Rio, but did his career in São Paulo, and is an artist who's very much connected to the São Paulo art scene. I'm gonna share my screen here with you because I want to show you some images. The idea for this exhibition is a bit unusual. It's my third exhibition focusing on the work of Flávio de Carvalho. But this time it was an exhibition that was commissioned by Sesc in Sao Paulo. And the idea was to bring the work of Flávio de Carvalho in dialogue with the work of contemporary artists. So I did this exhibition with Poliana Quintela, who just, during this process, she was nominated as a curator of the Pinacoteca. And we've been working in this project for maybe over a year. And for those who don't really know Sesc Pompeia, it was a former factory in a kind of formerly industrial neighborhood in Sao Paulo. And the space is really specific. The whole factory was repurposed by Lina Bobardi, the Italo-Brazilian architect. So it's not really a museum environment. So the whole exhibition was thought as a kind of response to the space, because this is really like a warehouse. And so, which means that we had lots of limitations in relation to which material we could bring, especially historical material by Flávio de Carvalho. And in this image, you can see more or less like this warehouse space. So Flávio, he is a very special artist, I think, because as many of you know, Brazil is kind of celebrating all over the institutions this year, the 100th anniversary of the Semana de 22, the 1922 Modern Art Week. Which is mostly associated to names like Tarsila do Amaral, although she wasn't part of the Semana. But this generation of artists connected to Tarsila, Anita Malfatti, and many others. So this project commissioned by Sesc is part somehow of these celebrations, although Flávio de Carvalho also didn't take part in the Semana de Arte Moderna. In fact, he was at the time in 1922, he had just returned to Brazil. He's someone who studied engineering in Durham in England, and then returned to Brazil in 1922 and started working as an engineer at the beginning of the decade. And then much later, in the 30s, he starts to show his paintings, but he also works with many different kinds of formats. And the interest in Flávio de Carvalho is actually as some kind of missing link between the Semana de Arte Moderna in 22 and the later more experimental practices in Brazilian art from the late 50s, early 60s. So I'm going to go through this, some images of the exhibition and try to explain a little bit at the same time what we focused on. The exhibition is kind of divided. I mean, it's not chronological, but it's divided into more or less 5 different sections. They're like focuses of interest in specific parts of Flávio de Carvalho production. So Flávio first starts to get closer to the art world the late 20s when he sets up his own architectural firm. And at the exhibition, we have an architecture section that focuses on 3 key projects by Flávio de Carvalho. And this is the first one. It's a design that he did for the government palace in Sao Paulo, and which at the time was quite revolutionary. We're talking about 1927. And at this time, Flávio was mainly submitting projects for public competitions. And this was one of them. And this was basically, he designed like a bunker, so which was quite offensive at the time. So this is mainly like a bunker that had like defense mechanisms like searchlights and landing strips for airplanes. So it was completely unusual project at the time. This is a night view where you can see the searchlights during the night to prevent attacks, like military attacks. And Flávio used the media quite well since that time to promote his projects. So the title of the show, which is Flávio de Carvalho Experimental, focuses a lot on this side of Flávio's output. That is like lots of projects that are of a kind of immaterial nature. He used the media throughout his career to promote his work quite a lot, which was quite pioneering. Second project in the architecture nucleus was this Farol de Colombo, the Columbus lighthouse. It was an international competition at the Dominican Republic. And Flávio's project, at the time, he became quite close to Oswald de Andrade from the anthropophagy movement. and he became a kind of like official representative of the anthropophagists in several congresses. And in this project, it was the only project submitted to this competition that drew on pre-Columbian elements. So all the elements that Flávio used in the building, like all the decorative elements, were taken from pre-Columbian cultures. These are some details. And here I'm going to speak about not all of them, but some of the contemporary artists that are present in the Sesc exhibition. So this was a commission by this artist from the Dominican Republic called Angel Leonardo. And Angel has been researching for a long time the work of Flávio de Carvalho, and specifically the Farol de Colombo. And in this exhibition, he created this sort of like crossroads using the design of one of the tilings that Flávio designed for the Farol de Colombo. And thing is, when Angel was looking into the project, he realized that Flávio used lots of references from Toltec, Aztec cultures, and many other cultures in Latin America, but he didn't reference anything from the Dominican Republic. And then Angel in the past few years has been researching Afro-Caribbean religions and has been using a lot of those references in his work. And for the Sesc Pompeii exhibition, he decided to create this massive installation, this crossroads that traverses all the space. And it kind of brings together two entities from Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian religion. So there's this entity called Papa Legba in the Caribbean, which kind of corresponds to this entity in Brazil, which is the Exu. And the crossroads is a symbol of the Exu. So we did a launch of this installation by Angel, and he invited these musicians from Brazil who are actually musicians and researchers who've been researching all the tunes from Candomblé. And so they played live all this. It was kind of like kind of a blessing to open the work during the exhibition. So they played all this, what they're called like the toques. So it's the tunes that are played in the Candomblé for Exu. And the third project in this architecture nucleus from Flávio is his own residence. It's one of the few projects that he actually built. It was his house, which was very important during his life as a kind of meeting point between all his network of intellectuals. So Flávio, as well as being an architect, engineer, playwright, painter, sculptor, etc., he was also a very important figure in the 30s in Brazil. And we have to remember, this is before the existence of modern art museums in the country. He created the Clube de Artistas Modernos, which was like an independent space in the 30s that played a very active role in promoting not only exhibitions, but also conferences, talks. He also created within this project space an arm that was supposed to be the dramatic arts arm, where he actually wrote and directed a play that we're going to see a little bit further. And this, going to another nucleus of the exhibition, this is Experiência número 2. So Flávio de Carvalho, he was mainly informed by psychoanalysis and ethnology, like his thoughts were informed by these two disciplines. And in 1931, he walked against a Catholic procession, against the flux of a Catholic procession in the center of Sao Paulo, wearing a hat, which was completely forbidden in this type of procession, and framed this as an experiment on the psychology of the masses. we have to remember as well that the 30s was a time, not only in Brazil, but in the world, when fascism was on the rise. And he was kind of like trying to test, you know, like the waters of this behavior of the masses. And then the same year, he wrote this book, which is split in two parts. So the first part is a description of what happened during this performance where he walked against the procession, and he was almost lynched. So when he was walking, he was kind of provoking. He was a very tall man, much taller than the average Brazilian. And he was walking against and looking people in the eye. And then at some point, the crowd started to scream, let's beat him up, let's lynch him. And he had to take refuge in a nearby shop. But he wrote this book and he illustrated this book with all these beautiful illustrations that describe the feelings that he experienced during this happening. And then this is a work of a contemporary artist that we put in relation to Experiência número 2. It's a young artist from Brazil called Guerreiro do Divino Amor, where he talks about the developmentalist mentality of Sao Paulo and how he uses these powers like the church and the media to create this more kind of, it's a very comic video that talks about like the use of media, religion, and, you know, for this myth of the Sao Paulo, there's the city that kind of like where work is concentrated and wealth. And then here is a picture of Flávio de Carvalho during his first exhibition, more conventional exhibition of paintings in 1934. And I'll go through this quickly. These are some of his paintings. In the exhibition, I decided to bring together lots of portraits that Flávio did. So Flávio de Carvalho was mainly a painter who focused on nudes and on portraits. But I think the portraits are quite interesting because they kind of create this inventory of Flávio's intellectual network. And the intellectual network was very important for him. It's something that he cultivated throughout his life. And it was very important in the sense that he curated shows in the 30s where he brought international artists to Brazil. He showed the first kind of abstract art exhibition in Brazil. So he did lots of very avant-garde events and exhibitions. He did the first with Osório César, who was an intellectual doctor who was later married to Tarsila do Amaral. He did a first exhibition of mental inpatients and children. So the idea to bring these portraits together in this exhibition was to kind of reveal this intellectual network that was part of Flávio de Carvalho's work. And on the left here, you see is a portrait of Oswaldo Andrade and Julieta Bárbara, his second wife. And on the right, it's a poet from Cuba, Nicolás Gulen. And all these people can be seen in photographs frequenting Flávio de Carvalho's house, his residence that we showed a bit earlier. So within this big vitrine that we had to build here, because this is, it's kind of a climate control vitrine that we had to build for the exhibition because it's a warehouse and it doesn't have museological conditions. I inserted two paintings by a young artist from Brazil called Pamela Castro. And Pamela is someone who started her career in graffiti, and she's from the suburbs of Rio. And she's been having a career as a painter for quite a few years now. And Pamela is doing something similar to Flávio in that she's focusing a lot on portraits of her own intellectual network. So the painting on the left is a portrait of Djamila Ribeiro, a very prominent philosopher. And then on the right is a self-portrait of Pamela Castro as Clara dos Anjos. And Clara dos Anjos is a character from a modernist book by Lima Barreto, who was an Afro-Brazilian writer. So, and this person, Clara dos Anjos, this character, she's the victim of this romance, yeah, because she's constantly abused. And Pamela painted this portrait after she had suffered abused. So there's lots of different connections that we can make here with Pamela's own network of intellectual relationships, but also with literature. Because here, the Clara dos Anjos portrait is just next to Oswald de Andrade and Julieta Bárbara. Then another aspect of Flávio de Carvalho's output is his work in theater. And so he did this play in 1933 that was closed by the police called the Dead Gods Dance. It was a bailado, which is a play with music and singing, and was the first play that had a majority of Black actors as well. And it was very much, it drew very much on Experiência número 2, in that it was very critical of the Catholic Church, of course. It talks about this dead God. And it ends with this sentence like, psychoanalysis killed God. And in the exhibition, I showed replicas of the original masks that were made in aluminum for the original play, and which were made by Teatro Oficina. So Teatro Oficina was also invited to perform the play, and they're going to perform this play at the theater in Sesc. And in fact, the first time they performed the original texts was when I did my second Flávio de Carvalho exhibition in Sao Paulo in 2019. And I invited them because I realized that the original text was quite short. It's only about like 20 minutes long. And so we did perform this first at the gallery, but then Teatro Oficina took it to their own theater and expanded the play. And now they're going to perform it again at Sesc, at the theater at Sesc. And here just a bit more of images of his relationship with theater. So these are original costumes that were designed for a ballet in 1954 during the celebrations of the 400th anniversary of the city of Sao Paulo, for a ballet by Camargo Guarnieri called A Cangaceira. And then at the back on the orange panel are the original drawings for the costumes and the set design. And then here, the final section of the exhibition focuses on Experiência número 3, which is when Flávio de Carvalho launched his tropical outfit, the outfit for the tropical man. And then this was in 56, and he was already like 56 or 57. Flávio was born in 1899. And he really planned this ahead. So the whole of 1956, Flávio de Carvalho had been writing articles like every week for a local newspaper, for a Sao Paulo newspaper, about fashion. And his take on fashion was very ethnographic, like he was talking about the evolution of fashion, and he had all these theories about the evolution of fashion. And then he publicly launched this outfit, and he paraded the outfit in the streets of Sao Paulo. And he presented that as with his usual humor and wit, as a very kind of like like a very plausible alternative to the old style of suit and tie that had been imported from Europe without any kind of questioning. And it wasn't really suitable for a tropical country. And then later in 71, he did these drawings. So 1970 is when the first World Cup was broadcast live and in color. And then this is from 72. And he designed these outfits for football players and judges. And the idea was to use this makeup to highlight the bodies of the players. And then I'll just finish here with two examples of how contemporary artists connect. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this. It's a work by Maxwell Alexandre that talks about fashion as well. This is a massive painting that you probably saw in the other slide. But basically here, Maxwell's work, Maxwell is also from Rio. He's from Rocinha. And he's re-signifying this uniform from his public school, like the blue outfits. He used to be very ashamed of that because all the poor kids went to public school. And but then he purposes that as fashion. So the idea, I mean, just to wrap up, the idea of this exhibition, it's not really to provide like a super kind of historical account of Flávio de Carvalho's practice, but kind of to see how his most radical propositions still reverberate with a younger generation of artists. And it's important to say that the artists we picked are really from a very young generation. So the idea is to try and see how this experimentalism, which I think Flávio de Carvalho, opened in Brazilian art history, continues to this day and still relevant.
Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you.
Hope you get well soon. We are going to hear Maurin Dietrich.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and especially for all the artists and organizers, curators and theorists who've been so welcoming here over the last few days in Buenos Aires. I'm really having the time of my life. Today I'm going to talk about just generally about the concept of a Kunstverein and focus on Kunstverein München, because this is where I currently work. And in sort of the lead up to this panel, we decided that I'm first going to talk about also the sort of first exhibition I worked on in 2019, looking at the work of Diamond Stingily. And I'm also quickly going to look into the practice of Pippa Garner, which was a show that I opened the week before I came to Buenos Aires. And before we sort of jump into the practice of Diamond, I wanted to quickly give you some context as in what a Kunstverein actually is, because it's a very specific organizational model that emerged at the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, when sort of what you had were sort of academies largely run and focused on sort of monarchic infrastructures, right? And the Kunstvereine all over the country emerged from a sort of new bourgeoisie that came into power, a new sort of needed a space not only for self-representation but for self-organizing, and they didn't see themselves reflected in a sort of big museums, but they rather wanted a space that was much more vital and represented this new emerging class. And the Kunstverein München was founded around the very beginning of that time, so 1823. It's celebrating its 200 years anniversary next year. And obviously, although the sort of socio-political landscape has radically changed to the situation 200 years ago, it is still a space for, predominantly artistic experimentation. We produce exhibitions, publications, discursive programs, but we also run, for example, 2 residency spaces that one is for writers and artists occupied with language, and then the other one is much broader. It's with around 30 artists that live and work together. And within that context, it is really a space that often presents the first institutional solo exhibition of international artists in Europe. and really also tries to look beyond the idea of emerging as a category that is sort of linked to age, but is rather sort of looking beyond that in terms of like who has not been seen but should be seen, who is at the sort of periphery of the art world but should have the platform of an institution behind them. And with this sort of line of thinking, I started a program in 2019 with the artist Diamond Stingily. Diamond Stingily is a US-American artist born in 1990, so really quite young, and has been developing this really interesting body of work between writing, this is where she comes from, this is sort of a daily practice of hers, as well as sculpture work. And she, in her work, often looks at ways in which an African-American experience in the US is deeply embedded into questions of everyday racism and violence. But instead of sort of talking collectively about that, what that means, she sort of focuses on very specific childhood memories and experiences that she translates into these sculpture works that we see in the main space of Kunstverein. And the main work that we presented there is a core work of her practice where they consist of over 700 trophies, sort of these conventional sports trophies that you would get, and usually at the sort of lower part it would have inscribed which place you reached in which category. But what she did was basically reframe them and tell a sort of fragmented story spatially of violence and of like a sort of the glorification of success, but also sort of zooming into her childhood experiences. She has two brothers that were quite famous NBA players, and looks at sort of what, for example, manages or provides you from getting a higher education, mostly in university systems, which is often linked to like a highly competitive sports. Therefore, you can get stipends and stuff. Another work that we showed in sort of the first space at Kunstverein München is this work. It traces sort of very poetically her relationship with her grandmother, and looks at the sort of intertwined moment of violence and care. You see these 5 doors, and then you have these baseball bats, these used sort of stand-ins for bodies leaning against the door. And it's a work that sort of departs from, again, the sort of looking at the mythology of identity and the very sort of close stories that we grow up with and Diamond grew up with, and she looks at these moments of where care, transgresses into violence, and she describes this moment when sort of growing up in the west side of Chicago, one of the things that was always at her grandmother's house next to the door were these baseball bats, sort of in sort of perception of immediate violence that was outside. And although obviously these objects are not being used, they sort of have inscribed the sort of moment of violence that they could potentially protect you against. And I'm going to jump right next to the Pippa Garner exhibition. And if you're interested in sort of more material, you can pick up some booklets. I brought some from Germany if you're interested. Pippa Garner is quite an exceptional artist. Pippa was born as Phil in 1942 in a Chicago suburb. She grew up as male and was, like most male population in the 60s, drafted to Vietnam. And sort of his way to sort of being resistant within the US Army was that she found out that there was a combat artist team, and these combat artist teams are very specific. The US government introduced the idea of basically sending artists to the front line of war to sort of glorify that, right? Like you had these like 18th, 19th century, you had this like large scale paintings glorifying the war. Yet these combat artist teams, obviously in the 60s, had no relevance anymore because the use of photography essentially, but they were the only way to prevent basically killing someone while still having to be in Vietnam. And this was really her way into experimenting with drawing as a way to trying to lead a non-violent life in the 60s as a man. And Pippa returns in the late 60s to the US and studies car design, and then is surrounded by a lot of interesting artists at that time, such as people like Ed Roche and a really radical film collective called End Farm, and many more. And through these sort of subtle interventions in public space that often talk about questions of class but also gender, she slowly identifies not only as female, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but also as an artist. That was really a sort of coming into being of, in one's own biography. And often these interventions, the only thing that we are left with today are photographs, because Pippa led a life where she moved like 50, 60 times around the US and Europe, and mostly these art objects and sort of performances and sort of large-scale sculpture works were recycled, reused, given away to friends, or they were just simply lost in sort of translation. And for example, this work, again, we don't have the licensing plate, but we do have the photograph of it, and it speaks about this moment in the early 80s where Pippa starts identifying as female, which is incredible early given sort of the time span of gender politics. There were no available ways in like where you could get a transition within an existing hospital system. You actually had to fly to Europe. In Brussels and Belgium in specific, they had a really advanced hospital systems that were providing that. But what you could get was like estrogen on the black market, like literally on Sunset Boulevard. And out of this time, throughout the 80s and 90s, emerges a practice that is often concerned with like very ephemeral gestures in public space. And this is the space of the Kunstverein, which you've seen it in Diamond. It's Diamond Stingily's exhibition. It's quite sort of transformed in this. But this is sort of how we translated it spatially. You have a main table in the middle, sort of looking at ephemeral works, printed matter, conversations, diary entries, documents from the Vietnam War, but mostly sort of looking at the artistic production from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as well as these sort of large-scale photographs that are also a documentation of the practice, but they're also a work in and of themselves. And maybe this is a good slide to end, sort of coming back to this question of gender and also class, where she got the money to basically produce this photo story, tweaking and looking at sort of the male highly sort of patriarchal domination of suits, and sort of by DIY tweaking these appearances of gender really changed and queered these encounters that were obviously really political at that time. So it is often the case in this exhibition that we did really tries to trace that, is that the different and also really what is considered the margins of the arts at that time, right, in the sort of spaces of freedom that Pippa was actively looking for, and that, for example, a lot of these works that ended up in this exhibition were never maybe commissioned by institutions or archives or galleries because they were simply not interested and not supportive and not caring, but they were, for example, commissioned and supported by friends or magazines. So it really tries to trace this also a sort of commercial and non-commercial aspect in the practice. Yeah, that's it.
Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecer a Arteba, a La Nación, a Salta, este espacio, esta posibilidad de estar acá, que es un placer. Voy a tratar de ser breve. En primer lugar, comentarles que cuando preparábamos este panel con visiones muy diferentes, pensábamos en la palabra experiencia y que tiene diversos niveles de significación. Por un lado, nos interesaba poner de relieve la oscilación entre experiencia en tanto performance, esa construcción en vivo que hace un artista, ese momento en que se despide otra energía, eso por un lado, y después la ruptura de límites que implica la experimentación artística por el otro. Esto es cómo los artistas ponen a prueba el presente, cómo examinan, testean nuestros modos de entender el mundo, cómo nos ofrecen la prueba del presente. Yo voy a hacer foco en un proyecto que fue uno de los grandes proyectos que presentó Malba en 2020, cuando yo trabajaba allí como curadora de proyectos especiales y programas públicos. Hablé con ella. Este es el proyecto. Era un proyecto de artistas por artistas. Lo curé junto a Gabriela Rangel y Verónica Rossi en colaboración con los equipos del museo. Inició en sala y se trasladó a la virtualidad por la crisis del COVID-19 cuando el museo tuvo que cerrar. Terminaron participando 40 artistas aproximadamente de América Latina. Nos interesaba observar cómo un artista habla con la obra de otro artista, es decir, cómo reacciona, responde a, cómo se relaciona con esa obra, y en esa respuesta íbamos a encontrar una aproximación a la obra de arte que difiere de los textos de sala que solemos leer en los museos o las explicaciones típicas de la historia del arte. Nos vamos a aproximar a esa obra de arte de otro modo y a su vez vamos a comprender también la obra del artista que habla con la otra obra. Voy a leer rápidamente el texto que escribí para el proyecto en su momento, el statement curatorial. A riesgo de decir lo obvio, de cara a una obra de arte, nos embarcamos en preguntas y respuestas que no se reducen a la mera transmisión de información. Hay algo más grande en curso. Conocemos la obra desconocida y nos vamos conociendo más a nosotros mismos. Dudamos y tomamos decisiones. Construimos interpretaciones que se desdoblan en dos. Por un lado, explicamos la obra. Por el otro lado, nos explicamos a nosotros mismos. Moldeamos nuestro yo. Las imágenes y las palabras que elegimos no son gratuitas. A nuestra manera, según nuestros principios, ponen en juego al poder, utilizándolo, modificándolo, repartiéndolo. Frente al arte movilizamos energía, cambiamos, hablamos y vivimos al mismo tiempo. Las respuestas que articulamos son activas, nos transforman a nosotros mismos y tienen la virtud de transformar, aunque modestamente, el mundo. Invitamos a artistas a elegir una obra de la colección Malba para hablar con ella, considerando su importancia, su relevancia histórica y los modos en que esa obra puede reconfigurar nuestro presente. Acá voy a focalizarme en uno de los proyectos. Me voy a focalizar en un proyecto que la artista Elena Dahn, una artista argentina, hizo. Ella seleccionó esta obra de Ana María Maiolino. Es un dibujo de Maiolino. Es un dibujo que se aleja de los métodos tradicionales del dibujo, porque Maiolino no lo hizo ni con un lápiz ni con un pincel, simplemente soltó una gota de tinta sobre una hoja de papel, movió la hoja, dejó que la gravedad actuara y que fuera la propia hoja, la propia gota, la que al deslizarse sobre la hoja de papel trazara la imagen final. El cuerpo de Maiolino es clave en esto, importan sus movimientos, es decir, la gestualidad, es eso que expresa sus afectos, que transmite sus mensajes internos. Según Maiolino, el gesto es la manifestación de lo que está dentro. En el gesto encontramos la cópula entre el afuera y el adentro. Si bien uso la palabra cópula, no la empleo en sentido sexual, sino en tanto unión, juntar algo con otra cosa. Esta unión entre el interior y el exterior es típica del arte de Maiolino. Estos son stills de un video que mostré yo en una exposición que curé hace unos años, en donde se veía cómo distintos artistas trabajaban a través de oposiciones y las desbarataban, masculino, femenino, presencia, ausencia, naturaleza, cultura, desarmando estos pares polares que estructuran nuestro pensamiento y en donde uno sería fundamental y el otro derivado secundario. Eran todas obras de artistas latinoamericanos y europeos conceptuales. Pero bueno, volviendo, hablé con ella. Elena trabajó sobre el dibujo de Maiolino. Elena Dahn es una artista que realiza, y voy a mostrar un poquito de su trabajo, esculturas infladas, relieves chorreados de yeso, emplea látex en murales y performances, lidia con contingencias, procesos, sitios. Su cuerpo también es clave. Toda su obra puede leerse como una negación de los valores de la escultura. Ella trabaja a contrapelo del acabado, la solidez, la monumentalidad. Yo me acerqué a su obra hace más de 10 años cuando la mostramos en Río de Janeiro en una exhibición que curé junto a Ernesto Neto y Marcio Botner, y desde entonces fui siguiendo su trabajo, y en ese momento de pandemia hablé con ella, ella seleccionó esta obra y yo quería traerles lo que ella hizo a ustedes hoy. En plena pandemia, en un momento de tensión, es decir, de enfermedad, expansión del virus, temor, Dahn puso en escena tensión propiamente dicha al ejercer fuerza sobre una obra o sobre el doble o espectro de la obra de María Maiolino. Confinada, Dahn dibujó la gota de Maiolino en la pared de su taller, pero ella no empleó tinta sino látex pigmentado de negro. Alteró la escala de la obra, la agrandó y la marcó sobre el muro. Colocó en su gota varias manos de látex líquido hasta que se endureció. Aprovechó las resonancias orgánicas del dibujo de Maiolino. Ella puso sus manos frente a las chorreaduras horizontales, como si esos vectores fuesen una especie de extensión de sus dedos, y tiró para desprender el material. La tinta de Maiolino se diluyó, literal. Se estiró hasta alcanzar su punto de ruptura. Dahn deformó el dibujo con su fuerza física, distorsionó la imagen y terminó despegándola, desapareciéndola. En su momento, Elena escribió sobre esta obra de Maiolino. Me interesa ese equilibrio tan fino entre abstracción y figuración, como esa mancha plantea una fuerza vertical y otra horizontal, capaces de generar un espacio. Dos formas opuestas que van juntas, una que se yergue, otra que echa raíces. Construyendo mediante la destrucción de la obra de Maiolino, Dahn planteaba preguntas profundas a la hora. ¿Qué movimientos, cambios de perspectiva, aire nos podía ofrecer el arte en ese presente irrespirable y oscuro? El desplazamiento literal de Dahn nos llevaba a pensar en deslizamientos figurados. Cuando preparaba esta charla pensaba por qué esta obra o este ejercicio de Elena fue tan oportuno y hablaba tanto al momento y a la hora. Y me doy cuenta que Elena trabaja con nociones de vulnerabilidad y resistencia importantes para la pandemia y la pospandemia. Recuerdo ahora, en pospandemia, la famosa frase de Samuel Beckett con la que cierra El Innombrable. La voy a leer para ponerle final a la charla. Allí donde estoy, no sé, no lo sabré nunca, en el silencio no se sabe, no puedo seguir, seguiré.
Gracias a las tres curadoras que nos han presentado sus proyectos. No sé si tenemos tiempo, pero me gustaba por lo menos dejar una pregunta planteada, esta idea de la experiencia, el experimento, qué centralidad tienen hoy en el arte latinoamericano y específicamente en este escenario pospandémico. Por ahí el proyecto que presentaste tenía bastante que ver con eso. Hermosa tu obra, Elena, una maravilla que está acá una belleza. Digo, bueno, preguntar un poco el tema de nuestra charla, ¿no? Bajar un poco a reflexionar sobre qué significa hoy, ¿no? Experiencia de experimento hay desde que el arte es arte, pero qué significa hoy en este contexto en que estamos viendo producciones.
Es verdad que el arte siempre fue ruptura de límites. Uno espera hoy que los artistas avancen más y que en este momento de tanta incertidumbre, pienso yo, nos presenten preguntas que nos desafíen. No espero que nos presenten respuestas, pero sí creo que el valor de una pregunta puede movilizarnos de una manera muy actual, muy urgente, y creo que es lo que puede hacer al arte contemporáneo contemporáneo.
Como un tránsito bastante claro de un concepto al otro, ¿no? De la experiencia que veíamos con de Carvalho al experimento de Elena Dahn, como no sé si hay un pasaje de centralidad de un concepto al otro.
I hope next time I come, my Spanish is more existent so we can have a more fluid conversation. But something that came to mind when you were talking was this sort of, I think I can less speak about what experiment can mean in sort of a Latin American context, because I'm just, you know, thanks to Salta getting started to actually delve into a whole universe of artistic production. But I think it's interesting to sort of look at that globally and look at spaces and practices where experiment is facilitated in sort of many different infrastructures. And I think if, you know, besides the sort of museum structures, Kunstvereine have always been that space in, let's say, a German context that facilitated experiment, like radical ones on very uncertain territory, you know, with artists that was mostly, as I said before, the first European solo exhibition ever. Most of them didn't have a gallery, or most of them have not been shown in that context. And I think, for example, someone like David Lamelas was exhibited for the first time in Europe at Kunstverein München. And, you know, sort of looking back, you sort of like to glorify that history, right? We were like the first ones to show that practice before everyone else sort of started noticing, archiving, and collecting. But what it really was probably was a very empty opening, right? So sort of, I think looking back, we sort of glorify these spaces and artistic movements that dealt and sort of lived through experimentation, but the lived experience of these actors and institutions who did the work is often very, you know, unglamorous and sort of a daily practice of resisting the urge of going with what's already known and settled.
No sé si alguien quiere preguntar algo o agregar algo más, Florencia.
No, yo quiero agradecerle a Elena que está acá y nada, es un placer trabajar con artistas provocadores que nos impulsan a pensar distinto, a sentir distinto, así que eso.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Les damos un aplauso a las oradoras.